Doctor Who fans will of course know that this month is the 50th anniversary of our favourite show. Now, just recently on the register.co.uk, I came across a list of top classic Doctor Who stories, 10 of them in all, and I just felt I had to share my thoughts on them with you because, as it happens, some of them are real crackers. And it starts off with The Ark in Space. Now, The Ark in Space is one of those brilliant examples of how Doctor Who, on a relatively tight budget, could do something that almost, had the grandiose vision and dream of being of a horror movie, whilst integrating a really quite well-written story in this case. Because this one features two things that work very well together. One, remoteness and isolation. The remains of mankind, basically, are cryogenically frozen on board the Ark in Space, which is a space station set millions of years in the future. And they're not alone, because when the Doctor and his pals, Harry, Sullivan and Sarah Jane, arrive, they find that something is menacing. Something very large, very creepy and very green. And it comes in the form of the insect-like Wyrn. Now, Doctor Who has always been kind of slightly derided for its use of fairly cheap special effects. But in this case, they managed to pull off something so brilliant with bubble wrap that you just wouldn't think it was possible. The transformation of one of the main supporting cast into one of these insects. Not only do they turn his arm into insect by the liberal application of the internal guts of a jiffy bag, plus some green spray paint, they also have a really neat way of making his face go insect, which happens at one episode conclusion. So, The Ark in Space, in my opinion, deserves to be in a list of top 10 classics. Now, the next in the list is one that maybe isn't quite so well known, but is an absolute corker in my opinion as well. It is The Caves of Androzani. Now, The Caves of Androzani is Peter Davison, i.e. the Fifth Doctor's last story. It's the story where he becomes Colin Baker. Not literally, but you know what I mean. And it has arguably one of the most adult, dark storylines of any Doctor Who story, particularly at that era, in that it's all about the drug trade, basically. There is a drug by the simple name of Spectrox, and it's not just any drug because it can prolong your life. And so, as you might imagine, the people of Androzani Major are somewhat keen to acquire large, and I mean large, amounts of this drug at any cost. However, it has a rather nasty side effect because when it's not properly processed, when it's raw, it can lead to a lethal condition which you of course all know of as Spectrox toxemia. Now, ultimately, it is that leads to the Doctor's regeneration, but this story, in my opinion, goes further than most in the horror stakes because of one particular moment. Now, in a lot of science fiction shows, and generally, drama series of the time, and maybe even now, when you get to a moment where, people are shot, or whatever, you often hear the guns go off, but you very rarely see them actually shooting at the people. Well, that doesn't happen here. The ending of episode 1 is absolutely brilliant. It features the Doctor and Perry being led out to face an execution squad for having basically done nothing wrong other than turned up and been in the wrong place at the wrong time, as is the way with Doctor Who. You then see the firing squad ready their guns and ready, aim, fire, bring in the sting of the closing credits. It's just brilliant. It really is. Now, I'm not going to tell you how they survive it because you've just got to watch it and find out. But that's not the only brilliant moment. Peter Davison often comes across his Doctor as being quite vulnerable, and I think that was deliberate. There was a sort of idea of making him a young man in terms of his body, but in spirit an old man, and the two not quite gelling somehow. Well, at the end of one episode, he has a proper go at one of the characters as he indignantly heads off to Androzani Minor to save his friend, basically. And it's just the way it's delivered. It's so triumphant, so powerful, leading, of course, up to the huge, big regeneration scene that takes place at the end of the story. Just goes to show what a bit of atmospheric direction and careful writing can really do in a show like Doctor Who. Now, for number 3. Number 3 is a comedy gem of this series, it has to be said. It's another Tom Baker story. It is City of Death. Now, it's true there have been quite a few Doctor Who stories, to be fair, that have of death in the title. But City of Death is the ultimate of death story, in my opinion, because it's just beautifully woven together. You've got whimsy, in that it's basically set in Paris in the art world. You've got this guy called Count Scarlione, whom, ladies and gentlemen, do not be fooled, for he is not who he seems. You've got the Doctor in his shambling bohemian costume. You've got Romana, the sort of very scientific and factual time lady, and lots of really brilliant comedy lines. And to top it all off, you've got a hard-boiled detective who just wants to basically slap everyone in the face. So, I mean, what are you going to do? It's Doctor Who, right? So, you know, what does make this story so brilliant is the combination of all those things to create something that is truly unique. I mean, that's really the only way I can put it. Because not many shows would be able to pull off high drama, Parisian romance, and a sort of wonderful soundtrack that rises and falls like the wheels of bicycles over the streets of Paris. It's brilliant, and you can imagine people, you know, sitting in cafes. In fact, you do see people sitting in cafes out the front having coffee and croissant and so on. But it is just fantastic. It is Tom Baker's Doctor in his element. But probably the one thing that story is known for more than anything else is its alien, the Jaggeroth, who is a classic example of those aliens who have a bigger head than the actor playing them, because you see him tear off what is quite obviously a fake human face mask to reveal a spaghetti head with one eye underneath. And that's the climax of one of the episodes. Absolutely top-notch Doctor Who. Now then, moving on from the City of Death, we go way back in time, relatively speaking, of course, to the William Hartnell era, and to the story The Crusade. Now, Doctor Who, when it first started, was intended to be largely educational, believe it or not, in nature. It also wasn't meant to go on for as long as it did. The idea was it was only supposed to go on for about 13 weeks. Well, just look what happened. Isn't it always the way? This won't go on for very long. Hey, look, 50 years later, here we are. But look, anyway, it started with the intention of, you know, let's try and educate the children who are watching this show whilst giving them a bit of a scare at the same time, right? William Hartnell, the first Doctor Who, slightly crusty but sharp as a knife underneath, and let's be honest, a bit bad-tempered when he wanted to be. Well, him and his companions have found their way to the Holy Land, to the time of the Crusade, where they encounter Richard the Lionheart and Saladin having a rather fearsome battle. And the great thing about these early historicals is how epic they were. Now, you know, you have to imagine they probably had even less budget back then than they had, you know, moving on to the 70s and 80s. So to pull off something that most kind of big, large-scale movies would have had difficulty doing convincingly, you know, on the budget of Doctor Who is quite an achievement. And, you know, I've seen a couple of them, and you do warm to them, you really do. There's a distinctly slower pace to the old Whos. But you know what? You kind of do see beyond it really quickly, and you see that they weren't really about flashbang wallop. They were about story. And, you know, that's what Doctor Who's always got to have at the core anyway. But back then it was so important because you didn't have video effects even and all that kind of stuff. But what you did have was history and time travel permanently bonded together in brilliantly, cleverly written stories like The Crusade. Now, at number 5 in the list is The Daleks. The Daleks is actually the title of the first, well, The Mutants, basically, is the title of the very first ever Dalek story. When they very first appeared, I believe it was the second story in the whole of Doctor Who, and my gosh were they a success. The Mutants does deserve to be there because it introduced possibly the most famous science fiction villain, bar none, in the entire world, the Daleks. And I know contemporary reviews at the time talk about people, children in playgrounds playing Dalek, almost straight after the show aired. And you know, if you remember, if you've seen clips of it, then you know there's that wonderful scene where a Dalek is menacing, I believe, Barbara, who's travelling with the Doctor alongside Ian Chesterton, and she is basically fearing for her life as a Dalek sucker is right up against her chest and it's chanting, "Exterminate!" What makes the story even more chilling, though, is the fact that it all takes place on a radiation-scarred planet, where the people, the Thals, have basically got a messed-up planet because there's been a rather nasty nuclear war, and hence the title The Mutants, really. So, the first story that introduces the Daleks is a classic, but then so is a Tom Baker story, which is next up in the list, called Genesis of the Daleks. Genesis of the Daleks is one of those stories that is so good that you almost feel like you've just stepped out of the cinema when you've seen it, and you think, that surely should have been more than just Doctor Who. And the reason is because of one scene, probably more than any other in the whole of Doctor Who, that just makes you go, wow, yeah, when you think about it, you know what I mean? So what happens is, basically, without giving too much away, I should say this story introduces good old Davros for the first time. Yep. But you have the Doctor, who has the opportunity to kill the Daleks at the moment of their inception. Imagine that. The Doctor could get rid of them from history for good, but he has doubts. He actually has doubts. Can he do it? Does he dare do it? And you get this really interesting moral question where, the universe without Daleks, would it actually be a worse place? I know, I know they're fictional, but it's an interesting question, isn't it? Does something as horrible as an evil as that actually unite people rather than, be something you need to get rid of? Well, I'm not saying there's an answer to that. There certainly isn't an answer in the story, because the Daleks do indeed survive. But it does have a fantastic scene which apparently was created because they didn't have a cliffhanger for one episode, where they got the Doctor to go in to a room full of Dalek, well, I don't know what you call them really, embryos I suppose, and get this green jelly-like blobby thing, which is basically a young Dalek, and walk out with it clamped to his face, alien style, and the Doctor is wailing and screaming, and you bring in the credits, and it is just fantastic, and you're behind the sofa going, oh no, oh, what's he going to do? So yes, where would we be without the Daleks anyway, let's be honest. Now, moving on to number 7 is a little bit of a shift in theme to a John Pertwee story, which it was, in fact, in his first season. It's called Inferno. Now, it's been described as Doctor Who's first nightmare, and probably not without good reason, actually. This was in the time when Doctor Who had been exiled to Earth, because the Time Lords decided he should not be meddling so much in the affairs of this little planet, and they exiled him there and made him forget, aren't they horrible, how to travel in space and time. But of course it did mean that instead of the Doctor going to the monsters, all the monsters came to Earth. And of course you had good old Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart and the whole of the unit gang, who became effectively a Doctor Who family, and virtually throughout long periods of the show. They've always been a part of it, even now of course. So Inferno is all about a project to drill to the Earth's core, which sounds amazingly Jules Verne, right? But what makes Inferno work so well is it's just dripping with darkness all the way through. And it just plays on so many of those horror cliches. It's got drooling monsters, it's got brilliantly atmospheric filming, in an old industrial plant, which just is just so perfect as a setting for the story. And it's got the Earth being destroyed by a great cataclysmic flow of magma, which is actually the conclusion to one of the episodes. And to top it all off, the Doctor finds himself in a dodgy parallel universe where all the people who were friends before are no longer friends. The Brigadier, who is a forthright, upstanding member of the military community in the normal world, is now an eye patch wearing tyrant, and the Doctor is basically his enemy. And it's just a really interesting twist on the whole kind of way that relationships have been formed so far in the series. But probably the bit that stands out for me the most is, I have to say, the slathering monsters that the people who work for this bizarre and dangerous project, led by a completely obsessive scientist, it has to be said, these people just turn into unthinking, green, slimy monsters. And the makeup's really good, has to be said. So overall, Inferno, whilst it may not be very well known, is, I think, one of the understated classics of the show. So yeah, it should be in the Registers list, I think so. Now then, at number 8, we're going back to Baker, Tom Baker that is, to The Robots of Death. Now this is from the 70s, again. It stars Leela, who was the savage, who for some reason the producers felt had to wear really, really short dresses. Now, you could argue that was to get the dads watching it after the sport had been on, but let's not go into that. Clever producers. But anyway, no, the Robots of Death takes place in a ship called a sand miner on a sort of deserty planet. So it's wonderfully science fiction, wonderfully Dune and sort of Frank Herbertish and such. And it basically features robots. Now, a lot of Doctor Who stories have robots, to be fair, but this one has Art Deco robots, and a truly brilliant Art Deco set that is just so stylish. It's amazing. It's like just walking straight back into the 20s. Brilliant. But, you know, these robots, they're called the Robots of Death for a good reason, because someone is trying to manipulate their very strong robots, okay, and they basically run the ship. So what happens when your computers turn against you? Well, that is exactly what happens in this story. And, you know, they are just so enduring. The image of a robot of death, a Vok robot in this case, particularly one plunging something very sharp and nasty into a human victim. So, yeah, Robots of Death, I concur, is indeed a classic Doctor Who story. Now, we're getting very close to the last two. In fact, we're at there now, pretty much, because this is 9 and 10, and it's the Pyramids of Mars up next. Another Tom Baker story. Pyramids of Mars is an example of what was at the time called Gothic Doctor Who. Under the leadership of Philip Hinchcliffe, they took a really strong Victorian Gothic theme to the stories, basically. And, you know, you can imagine, you've got time and space travel, you've got this shambling bohemian doctor who could at one moment be dark and one moment be scary, at one moment be comical, plunged into a sort of almost into a Victorian environment in this particular story, quite literally. But this story throws in another element as well, which often is found in scary sci-fi, and that is mummies and ancient Egypt. But of course, it being Doctor Who, it can't really just be mummies and Egypt. No, it's aliens from the future as well. One extremely powerful alien by the name of Sutekh, who even the Doctor is actually scared of. So that tells you something, right? But there's two things for me that stand out in this episode, and they are, well, the adventure as a whole, and they are this. At the end of the first episode, you have a cracking cliffhanger, right? It really is. There's a servant, a human servant, whose mind has been totally taken over. He's become a bum. He's become basically an unthinking slave to Sutekh. And Sutekh sends a sort of robotic, I think it is, creation through his time tunnel where he's trapped in the future. And there's the slave kneeling at the altar of the sort of temple that they set up for him in this old priory in England. And, you know, he's kneeling, he's saying, "Lord, my master, what can I do for you?" And basically, poor guy, really, you've got to feel sorry for him. This robot, this creature, puts his hands on his shoulders, and the moment he does so, he bursts into flame, right? You've got smoke coming out of his shoulders, and his words, and this is a brilliant last line for an episode, right? "I bring the gift of death to all mankind." Bring in the credits over that, if you will. So that works really well. And the other one is the fact it's got walking robot mummies in it. I mean, that's just classic, right? Walking robot mummies. What else could you possibly ask for? Now, we come to number 10, ladies and gentlemen, and it is a long, long story, quite literally. It's also a very important one because it is the War Games. Now, it's the last ever Patrick Troughton story. It's the last story to be filmed in black and white. Arguably one of the longest ever made, about 10 parts long. And this is the really big one, it features the first appearance and first naming, officially, of the Doctor's own people, the Time Lords. And admittedly doesn't really show them in the best of lights, because it's in this episode, or the end of this particular adventure, that they actually say to the Doctor, "You know what, mate? You really need to be exiled to Earth." And the Doctor's face changes again. But the thing about the War Games is another one of those stories that tries to be completely epic, because what you've got, just to give you a broad overview, is you have various different war game zones on an unnamed alien planet, and they're all basically really authentically done, but everyone who is caught in the zone, so to speak, is in real danger. And someone, a very nasty guy called the War Chief, is out for, he doesn't really care, he just wants to see people die, let's be honest. And the situation is so desperate, really, that the Doctor calls upon the help of his own people. And, you know, there's always been this sense, or there had been until that point in the series, that the Doctor was had a bit of a shady past. No one really knew who he was. And you know, who were his own people, why it was that he never really contacted them. You know, why did he not talk about them? What was it about his own people that was so awful that he would not actually bring himself to either discuss them or even actually, you know, go and visit them, let's be honest. You know, well, you know, we didn't know at that time that he nicked a TARDIS. Like, you know, really. So, you know, but yeah, for that reason, this story, The War Games, is, you have to be patient with it. It's a patient watch, but it's a good watch, and it's a rewarding one when you get to the end, because it just is one of those clinching turning points in Doctor Who. Not just because it kickstarts the Jon Pertwee era, which then is made in colour, but because it also gives Patrick Troughton, who was a really good Doctor, a nice kind of a really big dramatic swan song, let's be honest. I mean, that's what it really does. So those are the top 10 stories as named by the register.co.uk, and as you can probably tell, I'm in agreement. But if I had to name a story that's missing from that list, well, you know, the thing with me is that I love Doctor Who so much that it's actually quite hard to do. But, you know, I do want to throw one in of my own, and it's a bit of a curveball, ladies and gentlemen, because, you know, I think there are quite a few Doctor Who stories that are relatively understated, and some of them very understated, and one of those is actually Colin Baker's Sixth Doctor's first story. Now, it was almost universally disliked at the time of original broadcast, and still today it's one of the least popular of all the classic stories. It is The Twin Dilemma. Colin Baker's Doctor was intended to be a big, bolshy, arrogant, moody, basically a bit of an unpleasant very alien character after Peter Davison's vulnerable and almost kind of quite reserved portrayal of the character, you might say. Along comes Colin Baker, full of bombast, full of somewhat, you almost feel like you're treading on eggshells around him. In the case of poor old Perry getting strangled in the TARDIS in the first episode. Not literally, well, you know what, if he'd actually done it, then fair enough, you wouldn't like the Doctor very much, but no, he stopped himself. He did stop himself, realising he'd probably just having a bit of a funny turn. But yeah, The Twin Dilemma, to be fair, the story is a bit pants. It's not the best Doctor Who story ever, but it's Colin Baker's portrayal of the character, which at times is almost Shakespearean in the amount of power and passion that he gives it. But by the end of it, you're left feeling, okay, we've got a radically different Doctor. This one's going to take a bit of getting used to, but there's something there. And I think there was, because they went on to have a fairly good season the next year. And the year after that, maybe not so much, because the story was a bit all over the place. And of course, that's all Colin Baker got. So, you know, I think The Twin Dilemma is a good example of a don't knock it till you've tried it story. Now, you might hate it. You might think, oh, this is awful. Or you might think, Darren, yes, I can see what you're getting at there. Despite the obvious flaws in the story, there are actually, you know, little glimmers of light that shine through that maybe, on second viewing, makes you sort of question your first thoughts on it.